Welcome to the TenakaKaiSan's History of Warfare channel. This episode will delve into the details of a facet of warfare. This category of documentary is aptly called TenakaKaiSan's Warfare by Numbers. This episode is titled The Divine Wind Gusts. With this fourth video, I'm tipping my hand. I have a special regard for the Pacific theater of World War II. The Japanese Navy particularly has been my focus of learning from a formative age. Belying my nom de plume, TenakaKaiSan, I am not Japanese and am in fact a fifth-generation Canadian with English, Scottish, and French heritage, a true Heinz 57. Tanaka is a derivative of Razio Tanaka, who was an excellent vice admiral in the Pacific War. The Americans sometimes called him Tenacious Tanaka for his courage under fire and his ability to get the job done when others failed. I had initially considered making this YouTube channel solely about the Pacific Theater, but instead opted to make content about the history of warfare in general, since there are many other histories of warfare that I am greatly interested in. So my name is a modified version of the name Tanaka, used as a tip of the cap to that vice admiral. I added Kai, which means modified in Japanese, and San, which is a title of respect in Japanese. Well, enough about me, on to the subject at hand. When the layman thinks of the Japanese Kamikaze pilot in late World War II, one thinks of crazed zealots diving their planes into American ships and killing themselves in the off chance of damaging or destroying a ship. This description is not necessarily a fair one of the Japanese Special Attack Units, or Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai. The term kamikaze is generally the accepted term in the West for these warriors. As an aside, the word kamikaze, or divine wind, harkens back to the great typhoons that swamped and dispersed the entire Mongol invasion army as they sailed to conquer Japan in 1281. Before we delve into what the kamikazes were during the Pacific War, we need to better understand how they came about in the first place. With that knowledge, the complexities of this type of combat can be better understood. The Japanese mindset valued honor above all else. Whether it was called samurai spirit or the Bushido way, honor was an integral part of their lives and had been for hundreds of years. To die in combat was the most honorable action a warrior could be expected of. Hence why, during the Pacific War, when a soldier's position was about to be overrun, the soldier killed themselves by disembowelment or with a pistol to the temple rather than be captured. Or, when the situation was lost and the American positions had machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, the Japanese soldiers organized banzai charges, which was basically soldiers running across open spaces, waving katanas and rifles with bayonets, screaming and bellowing, into the awaiting firestorm. Or when sailors or airmen found themselves drifting in the ocean, they would swim away from American rescue ships, better to drown or be eaten by sharks than be captured. This honor-bound doctrine was drilled into all Japanese people, especially males, from childhood. They lived and breathed honor. Modern Western civilization has no mainstream parallel philosophical offering, where death is preferred to maintain one's honor. So dying in battle was the highest honor. By 1944, the Pacific War was going very poorly for the Japanese. A number of both tangible and intangible factors had turned their fight into a lost cause. The Americans were winning on all fronts, pushing back the Japanese defensive ring into an ever-shrinking perimeter, all the while preparing and executing the liberation of France. In the Pacific Theater, the Americans had more planes, more ships, and more soldiers. They had better equipment across all branches of the military. More importantly, the Americans had better technologies. This included better radar, radio communications, and general tactical organization. However, the Japanese people would not surrender in 1944. The dishonor would be too great, and maybe they could still somehow stem the tide if they couldn't turn it completely. Coupled with these rather obvious shortcomings were Japan's own resource and manpower difficulties. The majority of the best and brightest of Japanese military personnel were gone, ground up in the grist mill of the war to date. By 1944, the airmen of the Army and Navy Air Corps were hit especially hard. Not only were the pilots that were being produced too few in number, but they had very limited training due to Japan's immediate need on the front lines and its devastating oil shortages. Take these inexperienced pilots, put them in outdated aircraft, and pit them against American pilots with better aircraft and arguably the best training in the world. The results of this dire situation culminated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by some of the Americans who took part and historians alike. In the span of 2 days, the Japanese air assault damaged a single battleship, killing 24 American sailors, and destroyed 43 American aircraft, with an additional 80 aircraft being lost by running out of fuel. The damaging of a single American battleship was at the cost of between 550 and 650 Japanese aircraft destroyed, the loss of 3 fleet carriers, and upwards of 5,000 dead. The Americans had perfected the art of carrier warfare: radar, radio-vectored fighter interception, devastating anti-aircraft fire, superior air crews, and superior aircraft, saw a complete reversal of the roles between the warring factions in less than 3 years' time. The situation for the Japanese was critical. They could not continue to lose ships, pilots, and aircraft at this rate. What could be done? They could not magically start delivering fully trained air crews. They did have excellent new aircraft, but couldn't produce them near the numbers that the Americans could. Their fleet of ships was now dwarfed by the American fleet, and that gulf was widening as the months passed. The Japanese surely couldn't level that playing field by exceeding the production of the Americans. Regardless that all signs pointed to surrender, the military leaders in Japan, of which their prime minister was one, would not and could not truly contemplate that option in late 1944, not when there was even a glimmer of hope that they could turn things around, even if that glimmer wasn't entirely imagined. As mentioned during the Battle of Philippine Sea, approximately 600 Japanese aircraft were lost along with their air crews for the result of damaging 1 American battleship. Effectively speaking, approximately 1,500 Japanese airmen had died to damage 1 ship. The writing was on the wall. Either the Japanese had to surrender, or they needed to find some other way to make the Americans bleed themselves white and sue for an acceptable peace where the Japanese did not lose face on the world stage. The special attack units started out small, but the results were immediate. Here's the basic makeup of a special attack unit strike. 1. Use volunteer pilots who have been trained to take off, fly, and dive at high speeds. Gone was the need to train a pilot in detailed navigation, landing, gunnery, and other previously critical flight school courses. 2. Use available aircraft, stressing the use of older models. 3. Use less fuel as training time was greatly curtailed. 4. Use skilled pilots as fighter escorts and navigation beacons. These skilled pilots use the most modern fighters available for their task. 5. Strike in small groups from different altitude and compass headings. 6. Train that aircraft carriers were the principal target, followed by destroyers and cruisers. Battleships were too heavily armored for Kamikaze to deal effective damage. 7. Train that if suitable targets could not be located, pilots were instructed to return to base to await better conditions for their final flight. Do not squander their sacrifice. This is important. The Kamikaze pilot aircraft was not fueled only halfway to get to the target, but if they could not find the target, they had enough fuel to return home. Here's the conservative logic used by the Japanese at the time. If 10 Kamikaze pilots attack a ship and 2 planes hit successfully, the ship could be sunk or heavily damaged and 50 or 100 sailors could be killed. So for the sacrifice of 10 planes and 10 Japanese pilots, 1 destroyer or carrier could be put out of commission for at least several months and around 75 Americans killed. A conventional Japanese attack with the unskilled pilots of the time would see no hits on the ship and 9 out of 10 planes and pilots destroyed. No damaged American ships or American casualties. A truly hollow sacrifice. How effective were the Kamikaze attacks overall? The numbers usually used to outline the ratio of attacks versus hits is between 14 and 20%. This is much higher than conventional attack methods of any navy at the time. Just look at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Of the Japanese aircraft used in the battle, 288 were attack planes of one sort or another, and only 1 bomb hit was made on the battleship South Dakota. That's a ratio of 0.3%. The hit ratio for conventional attacks by the Americans during the same time period can best be summarized by their successes during the Japanese Tengo operation involving the battleship Yamato. This saw the Americans attacking in the most favorable conditions. The weather was clear, the Japanese ships had no fighter cover, they had limited effective anti-aircraft defenses, and the battleship was slow, very large, and had lackluster maneuverability. Now the Yamato had extensive anti-aircraft defenses, but the majority were 25mm cannons, which had proved to be short-ranged, slow to track, and arguably one of the worst small-caliber anti-aircraft cannons of any navy at the time. Coupled with all this, the battleship Yamato's escorts were 8 destroyers and 1 light cruiser, which offered minimal assistance in an air attack. Such was the situation for the American attack planes that they could loiter outside the range of the ship's guns to choose the best methods and directions for attack, an unheard of luxury at the time. 386 aircraft attacked the ship during the course of the day. Now, it's difficult to discern just how many torpedo planes, dive bombers, and rocket-equipped fighters attacked the Yamato and not her escorts, but let's postulate that around 175 bombers attacked the battleship. The Yamato received approximately 8 torpedo hits and 12 bomb hits before being rendered helpless. This equates to a hit ratio of 11.4%. The Yamato probably received more hits, but I'm counting only those hits received while the ship was underway and maneuvering, since those were the conditions of most ships that were under kamikaze attack. Therefore, even under the absolute best conditions, the best planes, the best pilots, and the best weaponry, the hit rate was 11.4%, versus the approximate 14 to 20% of kamikaze attacks. Why were these untrained Japanese pilots so much more successful than their better trained and better equipped counterparts? 2 primary factors can be attributed to these successes. Conventional air attacks saw the natural human instinct to release bombs or torpedoes early, maneuver hard in flight, and inadvertently spoil their aim, or abort an attack altogether when confronted by heavy anti-aircraft fire and fighters. Kamikaze pilots, on the other hand, knew they were sacrificing themselves honorably and needed to crash their planes into ships in order to do so. They were resolved to die in the attack. Unless the anti-aircraft fire mortally wounded or outright killed the pilot or crippled the plane to such an extent that the fighter couldn't reach the target, the plane would make it through. The second factor is directly related to the first. Anti-aircraft weapons and tracking technologies were not effective at completely stopping attack aircraft, especially one heading directly towards the ship at full speed. Both conventional torpedo and dive bombers slowed their approaches to make their aiming, release of ordnance, and getaway more successful. Kamikazes did not need to adhere to these principles of an attack. Only direct hits from 40mm or 5-inch shells could cripple an attacking kamikaze sufficiently to avoid it hitting American ships. These types of hits were rare on attacking kamikaze planes due to the 2 aforementioned factors. Sometimes the planes were crippled sufficiently, but were already too close to their target to stop the plane from making contact through simple momentum. Another lesser understood and harder to quantify factor in Japanese kamikaze attacks was the severe psychological effects such attacks had on some of the American sailors. The abject horror of watching an enemy pilot purposely crash themselves into your ship caused more cases of shell shock, PTSD, than all other reasons combined in the United States Navy in 1945. A common utterance among sailors was, "They hate us this much?" Many American sailors could not come to grips with witnessing the sacrificing of life in such a fashion. Even the more hardened sailors were affected when witnessing these attacks. So, just how successful were the kamikaze attacks against the Americans? Exact numbers are hard to find, but here are some gleaned from some reputable sources. 2,800 kamikaze planes sank 34 ships, damaged another 368, and killed around 4,900 sailors, wounding another 4,800. So, 2,800 Japanese airmen caused 9,700 American casualties and hit 402 ships. This equates to a 14.4% hit rate. Now, this rate does not take into account the fact that on many occasions more than a single kamikaze plane hit the same ship, meaning that the hit rate is actually a higher percentage. This same source states that 8.5% of all ships that were hit were sunk due to the inflicted damage. This is a far cry from the 0.3% hit rate of the Japanese airmen in June of 1944. As mentioned, some ships were hit multiple times by kamikazes during the same sortie. If, conservatively, an average of 1.5 planes hit each of the 402 ships, instead of the assumed 1 plane to 1 ship ratio, which gives us the percentage of 14.4%, then percentage of ships hit by kamikazes jumps to a whopping 21.5%. Some historians claim that kamikaze attacks were not a strategically sustainable method of fighting. I beg to differ. If the Japanese kamikaze tactics continued to be as successful as they were in 1944 and 1945, and the Americans had invaded the Japanese homeland, the Japanese really had no other method of exerting the kind of casualties that kamikazes could. A 21.5% hit rate plus a casualty ratio of 1 Japanese pilot for 3.5 Americans was a sobering prospect. Additionally, the Japanese pilots being trained for the impending invasion were being told to target transport ships. One can only imagine the carnage if 21.5% of the LSTs approaching the landing beaches were sunk by kamikazes. Each standard LST could hold nearly 200 men, plus the 100 men crewing the ship itself. These ships were slow, poorly armed, and armored. A single hit by a kamikaze aircraft would invariably sink an LST. Suddenly, the casualty ratio of 1 Japanese man to 3.5 American men changes substantially. Also, let us consider the material lost with these sinkings. A lucky GI could be rescued from the water, but gasoline, guns, tanks, trucks, plasma, food, and water would disappear into the murky depths, never to be recovered. Rounding these figures, if 100 LSTs are attacked as they assemble off the landing beaches by 200 kamikaze planes, with a hit rate of even just 10%, 20 LSTs are hit and sunk. Each LST has 300 men aboard, which equates to upwards of 6,000 American casualties. The Japanese have sacrificed 200 men to kill or wound 6,000 Americans. This is a ratio of 1 Japanese man to 30 American men. If the hit ratio is 20%, then the numbers are 40 LSTs sunk with a casualty ratio of 1 to 60. 12,000 American casualties for 200 Japanese deaths. Finally, the Japanese had more than 6,000 aircraft earmarked for the kamikaze role by August of 1945. Imagine how many aircraft and pilots would have been available by the time the invasion was planned to take place in October or November. The example above was only for a coordinated 200-plane attack. Furthermore, the trip from hidden airfields and caves on the island of Kyushu to the offshore invasion fleets would be exceptionally shorter than the previous kamikaze sorties of Okinawa. This made training simpler for the kamikaze pilots, fuel requirements easier for the Japanese, and American fighter interception far more difficult. The special attack units would indeed become a sound strategic plan for a desperate nation on the verge of total destruction. It has been documented that the Americans were devising other methods of tackling the kamikaze attacks that they were expecting during the invasion. These included the Big Blue Blanket, where Hellcats and the new-to-the-scene Bearcats would fly in stations to intercept bogies that the fleet and special radar-equipped bombers vectored them to. Without question, this would have had an impact on the special unit's operations, but this would have been considerably blunted by the fact that the kamikazes were to fly low to avoid radar and visual detection. The Japanese had learned too quickly what approach methods worked best during the Okinawa campaign. There can be no argument that the Japanese would have been equally quick to improve their special attack tactics based on what they experienced and saw during the initial approach of the invasion forces. Additionally, the radar operators would have had a tough time with the land masses in the form of substantial mountains that the kamikaze planes would have flown through and had their backs to as they approached their targets. Thirdly, the kamikaze's short flight times at maximum speed would have narrowed the interception window considerably for the fighters. Instead of cruising hundreds of kilometers over open waters, as the kamikazes needed to do so during the defense of Okinawa, some would have only had to fly 20 to 50 kilometers to strike landing craft and LSTs. Historically, if a fighter missed shooting down an attack plane on the way in, it would attempt to shoot it down on the way out, reducing the subsequent striking power of the attackers. The kamikazes weren't returning home, so this alternative was also off the table for the Americans. Some historians argue that the Japanese airfields would have been pounded to dust by tactical bombing before the invasion occurred, thus rendering the kamikaze threat mute. The Japanese have proven themselves excellent at camouflage and hiding airfields and aircraft in caves and ravines. This tactic would have been relatively simple to perform by the end of 1945. Also, the sheer number of airfields throughout southern Japan made this proposed pounding to dust impossible to accomplish effectively due to the staggering time, materials, and manpower required for this continual bombing operation. Airfields can be repaired quickly, and aircraft only needed to take off. One need only look at how quickly Henderson Field was returned to fully operational status on Guadalcanal to know how temporary and ineffective bombing would have been on hundreds of Japanese airfields in the region. Another major advantage for the Japanese were the targets available to them during an invasion: stationary or slow-moving transports and landing craft. At Okinawa, the Japanese had to deal with picket destroyers that operated far from the kamikaze's main targets, and those American ships were pounded mercilessly. With the invasion of the Japanese home islands, these picket ships were no longer a deterrent, as the transports would be close in to shore, which is where the aircraft were attacking from. The Americans had also planned to remove the 20mm Oclaron cannons and replace them with the 40mm Beaufort cannon whenever and wherever they could. The 40mm cannons had better effective range and hit much harder. Additionally, the Americans were in the final testing phase of a new 3-inch 50 caliber anti-aircraft cannon that ultimately proved exceptional at stopping aircraft, but they could not get these guns on ships in time for the first invasion. So, adding 2 or 4 40mm barrels to a destroyer, 4 to 8 more to a cruiser, and 12 to 16 more barrels to a battleship or carrier would have marginally improved their anti-kamikaze effort, but would not have been the miracle they needed. Direct hits were required on aircraft, and having heavier lead in the sky would bring down more planes, but not nearly enough to stem the tide of kamikaze attacks. The Japanese had also recently introduced the MXY-7 Oka flying bomb, which the Americans dubbed the Baka, or idiot in Japan. They were initially designed to be released from slow-moving bombers, and they themselves were easy targets. The Oka Model 43B Otsu was designed to be catapult-launched from caves and ravines. With a top speed of 400 miles per hour at sea level, these man-flying bombs would have been nearly impossible to intercept with fighters and equally difficult to knock down with anti-aircraft weapons at the time. The warhead on this variant of Oka was 1,800 pounds, the equivalent of 2 or 3 standard aircraft of the time used in special attack units. Since the Americans' only defense against these bombs was to shoot down their motherships before launching, the cave-launched Oka would have wreaked havoc. They were quicker to build than conventional aircraft, and they were faster, smaller, and packed a much heavier punch. Finally, the Americans had planned to fake an invasion by approaching the Japanese coast with decoy ships loaded with anti-aircraft weapons. The hope was that the Japanese would hurl the bulk of their kamikaze at these ships, draining the aircraft and pilot stockpiles before the real invasion happened. By mid-1945, the Japanese had become very adept at drawing the Americans in before pouncing. The last 2 major invasions on Iwo Jima and Okinawa saw this tactic in full effect. Gone were the murderous banzai charges that were the mainstay of the Japanese army early in the war. While some kamikazes would be lost to this foe invasion, the lion's share would be held back until the Japanese were sure the invasion was truly underway. Additionally, the Japanese would have had nearly triple the number of kamikaze planes ready for the invasion than what the American intelligence had estimated they could muster. It must be remembered that American intelligence estimated that the Japanese had 2,000 kamikaze planes earmarked for the final battles, and the Americans were planning accordingly. The Japanese were well on their way to having 10,000 kamikaze planes and pilots ready for November. They also had stored more than enough fuel for these aircraft to perform the tasks they had now been charged with. The sheer magnitude of what might have been is sobering indeed for both belligerents. As gruesome as the special attack unit seemed to Western ideologies, the projected results cannot be ignored. Indeed, had the Japanese had more robust and flexible training programs, had they more fuel for those planes from 1942 onwards, perhaps the special attack units would not have been needed. But one fact could not be changed for the Japanese as the war dragged on, regardless of their preparedness. The USA had nearly double the population of Japan. This war of attrition, coupled with American industrial capacity, meant that no matter how well the Japanese pilots flew conventionally and how good their planes were, there would always be more Americans than Japanese. More American military personnel, more American ships, more American planes, more American tanks, all, than the Japanese could ever dream of producing. By the end of 1944, the Americans were successfully bombing Japanese cities and infrastructure, wreaking havoc on Japanese production of war materials. During the same time period, Japanese pilots, whether flying conventional attacks or kamikaze attacks, were experiencing the same outcome. The pilots and their planes were not making it back home. The only difference? The kamikaze attacks were delivering much better results on American ships damaged or sunk. Conventional attacks, less than 1% success rate. Kamikaze attacks, more than 14% success rate. The same number of pilots dead and the same number of aircraft destroyed. The logic is chillingly unavoidable. The kamikaze was bred from desperation and a pre-existing core honor-bound belief, but the results of their ultimate sacrifices cannot be ignored, considering the position the Japanese have put themselves in by 1945. Thank you for watching. If you want to see a specific facet of war covered, send us an email. If you liked what you watched, then subscribe. If you want to support this channel, please click the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below and support the TenakaKaiSan channel as you see fit. As this episode ends, I'm TenakaKaiSan. I hope you learned something and enjoyed yourself while doing it. War is hell. Let's all take heed not to forget.